You weren't supposed to notice her. Just another young woman in a gray staff polo, earbuds tucked in, folding towels in the corner of the base gym while soldiers laughed and clanged weights. But that afternoon, when a high-ranking commander paused mid-stride and turned toward her with a single phrase that froze the room, "Night Lantern, briefing," everything changed. If you believe quiet warriors still walk among us long after the battle ends, like and subscribe, because this story proves honor doesn't fade just because someone stopped wearing a uniform. She was 28, a quiet civilian support worker at Fort Claiborne's fitness center, where the smell of rubber mats and disinfectant hung heavy and the speakers pumped out a half-hearted playlist of workout beats. Most days she moved like part of the furniture, quick, efficient, invisible. Towels folded into precise stacks, water coolers refilled, benches wiped down before sweat could dry. The enlisted soldiers barely noticed her except to toss sweaty gear in her direction or asked for more detergent pods. The young officers, all swagger and tight haircuts, sometimes smirked as she passed. But she's never done a ruck march in her life. One whispered once, loud enough for others to hear. She didn't flinch, didn't even look up. Only her hands, strong, deliberate, kept folding, corners perfectly squared, the way someone who's packed field gear 100 times might. On the surface, her life looked ordinary. Civilian contract job, small apartment off base, morning runs before dawn that no one saw. She'd left the Army 5 years earlier, trading the call sign Night Lantern for anonymity after an injury that hadn't ended her life, but had ended the path she'd once thought would define it. Back then, at 23, she'd been the one everyone followed in the dark, a combat rescue specialist who could read terrain and night optics like a second language, whose calm voice had guided trapped soldiers back from places no one should have survived. But medals don't pay rent, and trauma doesn't write job references. So now she folded towels. Quiet work. Safe work. Work that didn't require explaining the scars on her shoulder or why she still woke sweating at 3 a.m. That afternoon, the gym was loud with the usual clatter of plates and banter of young men trying to outdo one another. Lieutenant Keaton, barely 30 and already strutting with his air assault badge like it was a crown, leaned on the counter watching her stack towels. "Careful with those," he said with mock seriousness. "Might strain yourself. Don't want to break a nail." A couple of soldiers nearby chuckled. She gave a polite half-smile, the kind that ends conversations without escalating them, and kept working. Keaton rolled his eyes and turned back to his phone, satisfied with himself. None of them noticed the way she glanced briefly at the mirrored wall, checking exits, or how she folded every towel to exact regulation size, muscle memory etched from years of field prep. Outside, the late afternoon sun burned white across the tarmac. Inside, the door to the gym's locker room swung open and the air shifted. Conversations dulled as a tall figure stepped through. Colonel Avery Reese, commander of the 3rd Special Operations Group. The kind of man whose quiet carried weight. No one joked when he walked in. He was there for a pre-deployment check-in, talking with his aide about mission readiness, when his gaze slid casually across the room, and then stopped. Dead still. He looked right at her. For a beat, the noise of the gym seemed to fade, like someone had turned down the volume. The young woman didn't look up at first. She was tucking the last towel onto the shelf. Then she felt it. That sharp, assessing presence soldiers know when command eyes land on them. Slowly, she straightened, puzzled, a towel still in her hands. The colonel's face changed, not shock, exactly, but recognition so sudden it pulled the breath from the space. He took one step closer, boots striking deliberate against the rubber floor. And then, without ceremony, without raising his voice, he said the words no one there understood but her. "Night Lantern. Briefing." It wasn't a question. It was an order, soft but absolute, spoken in the kind of tone that means, "I know exactly who you are." Every head turned. Keaton's smirk evaporated. A pair of privates froze mid-laugh, dumbbells suspended in the air. Someone whispered, "Night, what?" But no one answered. The room had gone perfectly still. She didn't move for a second. Years of effort to disappear, cracked wide open in that single call sign. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She hadn't heard Night Lantern spoken aloud since the desert, since the last mission where she'd dragged a bleeding teammate out under blackout fire and kept an entire squad alive by nothing more than map memory and sheer grit. She swallowed hard and looked at him. Really looked. And saw not just a colonel, but her colonel from 5 years ago, alive because of choices she'd made when everything went wrong. No one else understood, but the air had shifted from casual gym chatter to something electric and reverent. The colonel didn't smile. He simply nodded once, the way soldiers do when acknowledging an equal. And in that stunned, echoing silence, the young officers who had dismissed her felt the floor tilt under their arrogance. This wasn't just the towel girl. This was someone who had walked through places they'd only read about and brought people home alive. She hadn't wanted attention. She hadn't wanted to be found. But on that quiet afternoon in the Fort Claiborne locker room, the past refused to stay buried. And for the first time since she'd folded her uniform away, the call sign night lantern had been spoken aloud. A small flare in a life she'd tried to make invisible, now burning bright again whether she wanted it to or not. The silence after the colonel spoke her call sign felt heavier than any weight room barbell. Every conversation in the gym had died mid-sentence, the clang of plates and the buzz of small talk gone in an instant. Lieutenant Keaton stood frozen, phone still in hand, his earlier smirk replaced by a pale, uncertain stare. The young woman, who had spent years mastering invisibility, felt every eye turn toward her. Her first instinct was to shrink, to shake her head and say they had the wrong person. But some things can't be outrun forever. She drew a slow, steady breath, placed the last folded towel on the stack, and turned to face Colonel Avery Reese. "Sir," she said quietly. His expression softened almost imperceptibly, but his voice stayed sharp with command. "With me." Then, turning toward the stunned room, he added, "At ease, gentlemen." But no one moved. The respect in his tone left no room for arrogance to survive. She followed him past the wide-eyed soldiers into the staff corridor that led to the small training office tucked behind the locker rooms. The space smelled faintly of disinfectant and leather gear. A tactical map hung crooked on one wall. Reese closed the door with a deliberate click, leaving the muffled shock of the gym behind. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He simply studied her, the way a commander studies terrain he hasn't seen in years but once trusted with his life. "I thought you left for good," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "I did," she answered. "At least, I tried." He gave a short, dry laugh, the kind that carries both relief and regret. "Night Lantern, I can't believe I'm saying that again. After Kashar Pass, we thought we'd lost you." Her jaw tightened at the memory. Kashar Pass, a mission buried under enough classified ink to vanish from public record, but burned into every survivor's mind. She could still feel the freezing wind, the blacked-out comms, the desperate scramble to get wounded out before the enemy closed in. She'd been 23 then, youngest on the team, but the only one with enough map sense and nerve to guide them blind through enemy terrain when GPS failed. One wrong turn and they all would have died. Instead, they'd lived. She'd earned the call sign Night Lantern that night because she'd been the one light in absolute darkness. But the rescue hadn't been free. A blast wave had torn her shoulder, left her with chronic pain and surgeries that didn't fully fix the damage. Command offered medical retirement. She took it, needing air after years of quiet trauma, disappearing into civilian life without farewell speeches or parades. Folding towels was supposed to be safe, supposed to mean no more shadows. "I'm just staff now, sir," she said, voice low. "Not here to make trouble." Reese shook his head slowly. "You were never trouble. You were the reason half my unit saw home again. I owe you more than I can ever repay." He hesitated, then added, "They don't know, do they? Any of them?" She gave a faint, almost wry smile. Would it matter? People see what they want. A silence stretched between them, full of unspoken things, the cost of heroism, the ache of fading into the background while others strutted on fresh orders. Reese finally exhaled, straightening his shoulders. "I didn't come here to embarrass you. But you deserve to be seen, Lantern. You always did." Before she could answer, the office door burst open. Keaton stood there, breathless, clearly having ignored every protocol to get to the truth. "Sir, he froze mid-sentence as his eyes darted between them. "I just wanted to say I didn't mean." Reese cut him off with a look sharp enough to slice the air. "Lieutenant, do you know who you're talking to?" Keaton stammered. She's a contractor." The colonel stepped closer, voice cold steel now. "Contractor? This is Specialist Aurora Vale, call sign Night Lantern. She pulled me and 6 others out of a dead zone ambush when comms were fried and air support couldn't reach us. She carried 2 men on her back across 3 clicks of hostile rock with a shattered shoulder. She's why I'm standing here today. Show some respect. Keaton's face went red, then white. He opened his mouth, closed it, and finally stuttered out, "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't know." Aurora, because the name she'd shed for anonymity was now laid bare, watched him, unreadable. She didn't gloat, didn't humiliate him, just met his eyes long enough for the message to land. Don't measure people by the job you see them doing. Reese turned back to her. "We're gathering the team tonight. Briefing room Bravo at 1900. I want you there." She shook her head instinctively. "Sir, I'm not active duty." "Doesn't matter," he said firmly. "Some lessons don't expire." His gaze softened then, just slightly. "We're training a new rescue unit. They need to know what real courage looks like. And I need them to meet the woman who once walked blind through fire and brought us home." She hesitated, the weight of old ghosts pressing in. Part of her wanted to stay invisible, to keep the fragile peace she'd built. But another part, deeper, stronger, remembered the long nights of doubt and the lives saved because she refused to quit when quitting was easiest. "Think about it," Reese said, reading her silence. "But either way, welcome home, Lantern." He left her alone in the small office, the door swinging shut behind him. Outside, she could hear the muffled stir of whispers, soldiers trying to piece together what had just happened, the call sign still echoing like an unanswered riddle. She sat for a long time, staring at the floor, feeling the years she'd spent hiding rub against the truth she could no longer bury. Back in the gym, Keaton waited awkwardly, posture stiff with shame. When she stepped out, he snapped instinctively to attention, unsure what else to do. She didn't ask for it, but she nodded once, a quiet acceptance. As she walked past, the room stayed hushed. The once loud chatter had thinned to respectful silence. The invisible towel girl had vanished. In her place stood someone they were suddenly desperate to understand. Aurora Vale didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her presence said everything. Some wars end on paper, but courage doesn't retire. And though she had folded towels to stay unseen, the light she once carried had just been called back into the open, and it would not go unnoticed again. That night, the fluorescent lights in briefing room Bravo glowed low and steady, throwing long shadows across the polished floor. Rows of young operators in fresh tactical gear filled the seats, restless at first, whispering and glancing at their watches. They'd been told this was a last-minute leadership session before deployment, nothing more. But when Colonel Avery Reese strode to the front with a single woman behind him, the air changed. He didn't slam a hand on the podium or bark orders. He simply turned to face the room and said, calm but carrying, "Attention." Boots snapped, chairs scraped, conversations died mid-breath. And then he stepped aside so every soldier could see the woman at his shoulder. "This," Reese said, voice low but resonant, "is Specialist Aurora Vale. Call sign Night Lantern. Some of you think you know what courage looks like, the badges on your chest, the ruck marches, the training runs. But 5 years ago, when every light we trusted failed, and when I thought none of us were making it home, she was the one who walked us out of hell." A ripple moved through the room, a collective inhale, quiet and stunned. Aurora stood motionless, hands at her sides, shoulders squared but not seeking the spotlight. She looked younger than most expected, small in frame compared to the armored men filling the seats. But her presence carried something heavier than rank, earned gravity. Reese told them the story piece by piece. Kashar Pass. The night comms died, and the unit was stranded in enemy territory. How Aurora, 23 and barely recovered from a sprained ankle, volunteered to navigate in pitch black through a canyon she'd only studied once on a digital map. How she carried 2 wounded teammates while directing the rest silently with hand signals, one arm useless from shrapnel tearing through her shoulder. How she refused medevac until every man was across. "If you want to know why I'm standing here giving you this briefing," Reese said, voice steady but raw, "it's because Night Lantern would not let the dark win." Keaton was in the back row, stiff as stone, his face pale with shame and awe. Around him, soldiers who had chuckled earlier now sat rigid, silent. Some swallowed hard. Others stared at the floor, suddenly aware of how easily they had dismissed the woman who now stood before them. Reese turned to her then, his expression softening. Aurora, I know you didn't ask for this, but they need to hear from you. She hesitated, heart thundering. She hadn't spoken to a room like this since the day she signed her medical retirement papers. But hiding had cost her something too, the belief that her story still mattered. Slowly, she stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but carried farther than she expected. I'm not here to be a hero, she said. I came back because I needed to heal, and because sometimes disappearing feels safer than being seen. She paused, letting the silence settle. But the night I earned that call sign wasn't about glory. It was about staying when running was easier. It was about protecting the people next to me when everything went wrong. She glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of soldiers who moments ago hadn't even known her name. You want to know what courage is? It's not medals or rank. It's doing the right thing when no one's watching, when it costs you, when it scares you. It's showing up anyway. The room stayed utterly still. Not a cough, not a shuffle. Only the hum of the lights and the faint thud of someone's heartbeat in their own ears. Then Reese stepped forward again. On behalf of every life you saved, he said simply, thank you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh unit patch, the insignia of the new rescue team these young soldiers were training to join. He didn't pin it like a promotion. He pressed it gently into her palm. You built the path they're walking tonight. Aurora looked down at the patch, throat tight. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to feel seen again, not by rank, but by the truth of what she'd done. She closed her fingers slowly around it. Then, without any formal order, a sound rolled through the room. Boots scraping against the floor as every soldier stood at once. Not loud, not chaotic, just absolute, silent respect. One by one, hands lifted in salute, crisp, unwavering. Even Keaton, his jaw tight, his eyes glassy with something he didn't want to show, raised his hand. Aurora didn't cry. She didn't break. But she did lift her chin and return the salute, steady and sure. Like the soldier, she had always been beneath the quiet. When the room finally lowered their hands, Reese spoke again, voice quiet but cutting through the air. Remember this night. Remember that the strongest among you may not wear a uniform anymore. And never, never, judge the quiet ones. The debrief ended without applause. No one clapped because it wasn't a performance. It was a passing of wisdom from someone who had earned it the hard way. As soldiers filed out, many paused to nod or offer a quiet ma'am. The kind that comes not from rule but respect. Keaton lingered last, stepping up awkwardly. Specialist Vale, he said, voice low, I was wrong. I'm sorry. Aurora gave him a small, almost kind smile. Just remember, everybody starts somewhere. Just make sure you don't stay blind. He nodded, chastened, and left. When the room finally emptied, Aurora stood alone for a moment, the patch still warm in her hand. For the first time in years, she felt the weight she'd been carrying lighten, just enough to breathe easier. She hadn't asked for recognition, but she'd found something better, understanding. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. She stepped out into it slowly, feeling the hush of the base after lights out. Somewhere behind her, she knew whispers would ripple, night lantern, but that was no longer a burden. It was a truth reclaimed. The narrator's voice closed softly over the scene. Some warriors never stopped serving, they just stopped asking to be seen. Aurora Vale folded towels to disappear, but when darkness called her name again, the room learned what true courage looks like. If you believe quiet valor still matters, honor it. Like this story, share it, and remember the night lanterns among us.